claiming fees and claiming expenses. Other times it's kind of scheduled out for them. So what we're looking into today is setting up a payment schedule based on a contract. So here what we have is we have a contract that has a start date and an end date. So it's going from beginning of August to end of January 2019.
Carol,
we have, yes?
Share your screen, please.
Sorry? You're not seeing my screen?
Share your screen.
Let me double check. I thought I was. Now hopefully I am.
Oh, there we are.
Great, sorry for that, thanks. Great, so we have a contract start date and we have a contract end date for this contract. We know that it's a fee claim contract, so we know that we're gonna be expecting fees that are being claimed, and we wanna set up a schedule for that. And we have a contract value. So essentially what we wanna do is we wanna spread out this contract value into scheduled payments, one per month, and each of them being scheduled for the end of the month. We want to do that as soon as a contract is signed. So this is not something that we do from the very start. A contract kind of goes through reviews, and at some stage we say, well, this has now been signed. Now we can schedule those payments. So I'm just going to quickly do that and keep my fingers crossed that this is actually going to work. If I look at there we go. If I look at the related milestones and scheduled payments here, I can now see that I have 6 payments scheduled, each one with an equal amount, with the last one making up any rounding differences. So that was something we were eager to achieve as well, to ensure that you don't get very odd amounts that are not realistic in any case. Let's have a look on how that works at the back end. So this is something we're achieving through Flow, specifically this piece. And when we're talking about flows, we really have, they really come in 2 flavors. One of them is auto-launch flows. So this is what we have here. Based on an action, we launch a flow. The other one is a visual flow. Visual flows are for when you want to actually have the user interact with your system, so much more directly. So for example, I can show you what that looks like. If I were to go to a different stage here, we actually have a small visual flow component here where you can see that you have buttons for the user to interact with. They add information, they can add fields. You can have kind of like conditional fields showing up or not showing up. So in this case, rejection comments are only relevant if you have rejections. And it's the user who launches this by clicking next. In the case we have with the signed and the scheduled payments, we're launching that automatically, and we need a little process builder to help us out with that. So what we have is we have this process builder, and let me know if screens are loading in time or if I'm moving too fast through this. We have a little process builder that checks whether a contract has been signed, and once it has been signed, it goes in and creates the scheduled payments by launching the flow. What you have in the flow at the beginning is you have input variables that we can have a look at in a moment that you give through the process builder. So this is how you start it, and you can combine it with other automation, right? You might want to do other things than just launch this flow, but this might be a part of it. So you control auto launch flows through other pieces of automation. Once we go into the flow, we have our interface. Some of you might have seen this already. It looks more complicated than it is. In the middle, we have kind of a drag and drop, again, where we can build our flow out. And on the left, we have all of the resources that we need to do that. We have what's called the palette, where you have actual steps that you can pull in. So all of these come from the palette. You have resources, where you manage variables and formulas, for example. And you have an explorer, which is essentially repeating everything you have on the screen here, plus things that you don't see because they're hidden. So these are the actual variables that you set up, the actual formulas that you set up, the decisions, the outcome, the assignments, the creates, etc. When you set up a flow, and well, I think it goes for any flow, but specifically also auto-launched ones, the very first thing you want to do is find the record again with which you started your flow. So looking up the record that initially kicked this off based on the ID that you have fed through the process builder. Maybe here a quick analogy. When I think of flows versus process builders, for example, if you think of them as little workers in your factory that is your system, flows are immensely more smart than your average process builder. You can imagine your process builder, they kind of sit in a line which is assigned to them, which is based on the objects they work on. They can talk to the people next to them. So, you can look up to the parent, you can find the children, but really not much more than that. They're stuck there. You can hand them a set of instructions and they'll go through that. They'll check whether specific criteria match and then update the record for you. But they won't go much further than that. The flow it's much smarter than that and can go a lot more different ways. But you also need to give it the resources in different ways because of that. So typically what you do is you give it the input variable and it goes and finds the contract. So what we say is look up the contract, renaming the fast lookup. And one caveat here is that this was designed and configured before Jesse had brought out a set of best practices in Confluence. Please review those in terms of naming components and steps in your flow, because this isn't quite in line with that yet. What we do then is we find the contract that started the process, so the contract for which we want to schedule payments, and we can use one or multiple criteria to do this. So we don't just have to go by the record ID, we could also go by other criteria. That becomes quite powerful if you're looking for something other than necessarily something that you have an ID for. We'll see that in a second example in a bit. You then have to, and that's different from the process builder, you then have to assign the record that you found to a variable. So you can imagine your little flow worker in your factory needs to actually write down on a piece of paper what the ID was of the contract that you gave it. And the piece of paper is your variable, so that's the contract that you can name. Variables are created, so you could also create a new one here if you wanted to. And then you need to add the information that the flow should retain. So in addition to creating the piece of paper, writing the contract ID on it, you need to tell it what else it should remember about this contract, because only the things you give it to remember are the things that you can actually use later on in the flow. So in this case, we tell it, okay, write down this contract, and then you need to know the start date, the end date, the value, the name of the project, and the unit, which is about kind of what we schedule in the payments. Does this make sense so far? I'm interpreting silences, yes, but I can stop for a quick round of questions if you want.
I've heard yeses.
Okay, perfect. Good, so we've told it, write down this contract, write down these fields. We will need those to continue on. So when you design, keep in mind that you'll need to think about which fields you're actually using in the flow. Now let's hide this, there we go. Great, now we have our contract. We need to figure out how many scheduled payment we need. So one of the first things we want to do is we want to set the number of months that we have in this contract. What we use for this is a formula that we then assign to a variable. So if you look at this in the Explorer, we have a formula that is the contract month. This is calculated, right? So here we just have a typical date formula to say, okay, find out how many months are in this contract based on the year and month and date. We need to assign this again, so the formula is automatically calculated, so we couldn't update that value. So instead of using the formula directly, we want to have it as a variable, which is the month counter here. This is just a number variable where we say we don't have a default value. We have a type for each value. This one is private, meaning we're only using it within the flow, versus other variables could be input or output variables. So for example, the initial contract ID is an input variable. We're assigning the number of months so that we can later use it and update it because we want to count the months that we're using. Then we start creating payments. This is a record create component, and one of the things that you'll use quite a bit when using flows. And I think, Mel, this also pertains to your use case for eJAF, where you basically go in and say, okay, we want to create a record. And the cool thing again is here you can create any type of record. So you're not stuck to your data model. In this specific case, milestones are related to contracts, but you might also create financial records that have no direct relationship within Salesforce to your contract object. And in a way, Flow will see it that way, right? You need to actually give it the contract ID back. So now you give it a sheet and say, well, okay, go in and create a milestone with all of the following information. We have a contract, we have the milestone number, which is another variable that we use. This one is just a counter that we use to count up how many milestones we have to ensure that the first one, if we look back at sorry, yeah. Is there a question?
No, sorry, Carol.
Okay, cool. You see that these here are nicely numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in order to achieve that, we need to count from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's what this add month does. We have the scheduled payment name, which is a formula. The formula being add months plus scheduled payment. We have the project, which if you remember is one of the things we told the flow to remember before, because we needed it again. We have quantity, in this case, we know it's always 1. We have a big quo issue, because this is a record type ID, which it really, really shouldn't be, which we're going to fix, I think, right now. We have a scheduled date, which we can look at. It's another formula just to figure out the dates. And we have the amount per payment, another formula, and then finally the unit that we inherited from above. So we can really be quite flexible here. But again, the important piece is that you're not actually defining most of these things directly in the step as you would in the process builder. You could now assign the scheduled payment if you wanted to use it later again. You could tell it to remember it. If you don't tell it to record the ID, it's just going to essentially create the scheduled payment and be done with it. Leave it in a drawer and walk away. But you could also tell it to hold on to it so that we can use it if we wanted to make further updates down the line, which right now we don't. Let's fix this record type ID thing, just so that we have the quo right here, by adding in a new formula. Adding a new variable or formula is always through the resources here. In this case, I'm going to say I want to have a formula, because what I've done is I've stored the record type IDs in a custom label in order to not have the necessity of updating that, of having it in every individual components. Jesse will be able to tell you much, much more about why we should never, ever reference the record type ID directly here. So let's add in a formula. We're going to add this FX, which I've recently read is what we should be doing when naming a formula. And we're going to name this scheduled payment RTID. This is a text, right? It's an ID. And then we can access, again, any variables that we have, any formulas that we have. So if I were to look in here, I can see all the formulas that I've already designed. So I can also have formulas that reference each other within a flow. And I can have system and global variables, where I also have labels. Let's go through that. Let's find my milestone record type ID, use that. There we go. And then I can update my record type, record create, to say I don't want to reference a number directly. I want to find one of my variables or formulas. In this case, it's a formula. And find my scheduled payment record type ID. So this is how you go about using formulas and variables when you add them in here. Again, think of this list of resources that you have here as like notes that the flow is making to itself as it goes along. And you just need to tell it what it needs to note down. Great, so now we've just created one scheduled payment, but we want to have additional ones. What we do in this case is we say, okay, the number of payments depends on the contract length, right? It could be any number. So what we do is we start from the top. We say we have a number, which is the set number of months, which was 6 payments, I believe. We started by creating one of them. And now we want to deduct 1 month so that we know, well, now we need to create 5 more because we've done 1. So what I'm doing is I'm deducting 1 from the month counter, saying, okay, now we only need 5 more. And I'm adding 1 to the add month, which we use in the name of the payment schedule. Scheduled payment, this way around. Then I'm making a decision. I basically, at this stage, I don't know, do I have 5 left? Do I have 3 left? I don't know, so I'm going to make a decision. This is another resource that you have from the palette about how many payments are remaining. You can add to decision node, you can add however many outcomes you want. So there's no kind of limitation to this in terms of only having 2 potential outcomes. And again, it's one of the things that makes Flow much more flexible than Process Builder, because you can branch out into many different conditions, and you can also have multiple conditions behind each other. So you can make one decision and then move into the next one until you get essentially a decision tree. In this one, I really just want to know how many do I have remaining. I'm most interested in I have 1 remaining or I have more than 1 remaining. If I still have more than 1 payment remaining to be done, I say, well, go back, create another one. And then I check again, well, now how many do I have remaining? I had 5 previously, that means 4, that's still more than 1. And so I go through this until I end up with only my last payment to be done. Why do I take out the last payment? If you recall, one of the requirements we had is that these amounts are nicely rounded. So this is something I've accounted for in my formula for the amount. I'll have a quick look at what that looks like. Formulas, amount per payment is taking the contract value over the month and then rounding down. So I know there's a rounding difference to be accounted for that I haven't previously included, that I have specifically taken away. Meaning that for my last payment, I will need to add any rounding differences that come up. So the difference you see in this record create here is that we have a last payment value, which is its own formula again, which is amount per payment plus last payment add. So this is where you see how the formulas can play together. And the last payment add is essentially just calculating what was the difference. Great, once I've done that, I've created all of my scheduled payment. Now one thing remains is essentially if I'm saying, well, realistically speaking, especially as we introduce the system, people are going to make mistakes. They might mark something as signed and then later realize, well, they were a little bit hasty in clicking that button. It actually shouldn't be. They need to go back and forth. Who knows what users do? And one of the things we wanted to ensure is that if they do go back and forth for any kind of reason, that we're not creating more and more payments, because that would seriously seriously mistake the data they have on their financials. So the last thing we do here is we update our original record. We update the contract. So we find, again, the contract. And here that remember what you did before comes in. The flow doesn't actually retain your record, but it retained that you gave it the ID, and it can search for it again at the end of this process, find it, and then update it. What we do here is we just have a little checkbox on the record to say scheduled payments created, true or false, to check whether they have already been done so that we don't recreate them multiple times. And then we're done. That's our flow. I have a second example to talk through, but I want to leave a little bit of space for questions at this point.
Hi, Carol.
So-
I have one question. On the decision for payments remaining, could you pull that up very quickly?
Sure.
You had one outcome be equals 0. And I was
Yes.
wondering if that was deliberate or not.
Yeah, it's a great question. No, I think I should have deleted this. Caught on to a quo issue here. I'd started out by saying, well, create all of the payments. Oh, shoot. I shouldn't have done that. Anyway, I can reload. I started out essentially saying, well, create all of
You can
them.
undo that.
We're done. And then I realized I need to account for this rounding difference.
Got it. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
You can click undo next to the close button.
Thank you, Jesse. Then I don't need to redo the quo update with the record type ID. Cool. Mel, specifically on your side, any questions?
We have a question over here too, Carol.
Yeah?
Carol, so my question is, what is your general, or maybe Jesse and you can both answer this, best practices in designing a flow? So before you even come to this step of setting it up, what is the thought process and what is the checklist that we should go through before deciding what kind of automation to use and how to set up this flow intelligently?
Sure. Jesse, do you want to answer that one from your perspective?
Sure. I think when approaching the design of the flow, you want to think about it in the context of how you would approach a set of specs for a trigger. So ideally, one thinks about a simple process flow diagram of what needs to happen when. The more you understand flows, the better you'll figure out how many nodes you need to have to that. I would suggest reading that kind of in-progress guide, Aditi. I think, Kyle, you have that open right now, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a blog post in Conference with just some thoughts around how to approach it. You can read through that, but also ask questions there. I'm not sure if it covers everything that you might need, but just some thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of kind of practicalities, I find often, especially, it's getting easier over time, but with your first flow or two, it's worth just opening a copy of your sandbox and doing a bit of a POC. So kind of trying out what the different resources are and whether what you're planning can actually work. You should still review it with an architect once you have the flow diagram in place, because there's also a lot of potential concerns around things like data volumes, right? I know that my number of payments, it's never more than 2 years, so it's not a huge deal, but what would happen if for some reason I have a contract that contains 1,000 a month? What does that mean, So worth having that documentation and sharing it with whoever is reviewing your technical architecture. Cool. Any other questions?
I have a question for Carol and maybe Jesse as well about the Confluence best practice for naming. So for naming prefix flow underscore the actual name of the flow, is that only for the backend or does the user see that as well?
Depends on where it is. If it's a flow screen, they would see that. So maybe the flow screen is the one exception, depending on what you're trying to do. The big reason for that naming convention is because when it comes to deploying flows and process builder, they both appear within the flow definition section. So it's just nice to be able to distinguish between the two.
Thank you.
The other thing that I can tell from just, reviewing what we've done now is if I look at this and look at my create, I can see that all of these are either variables or formulas or something like that, but I can't actually see which one it is other than for this new one where I used the convention and now know FX stands for formula. So I know this is a formula. Whereas with add month, quite frankly, from this alone, I can't tell what type of resource this is. Yeah, and this is all a very not so subtle fight for more quo as we do these things. Great. Other questions? Should I go into a second example? A lot of silence.
Yeah, I think go for the second example, Carol. I don't have any questions.
Okay, great. The second example is one that's more about finding an unrelated record in your system. The use case in this case was that IGC manages financials and budget lines specifically for their projects, and they need to integrate that with their finance system. They need to be able to reference in their finance system what they have in here. In their project management system, they collect a lot of very detailed information about the types of budget lines they have with categories and subcategories. They need some of that same information in their finance system, but the categorization is not quite the same because it's a little less granular. So in their finance system, some of what are different subcategories here are lumped together in one category in their finance system. And they're identified through this expense code. So Aptos is the name of their finance system, and they have these expense codes that are based on the type of budget line. So is it an expense or a fee, the category, and then the subcategory between that. And what they needed is essentially having that expense code calculated every time that a new budget line is added. And there's way too many options to fit into a formula in any kind of way. And the other thing we know about the IGC is that they're really re-engineering a lot of their processes. There's little stability in how these things are managed. So there's a very high probability that in 2 months they're going to tell us, well, actually data collection subcategory communications shouldn't be V3025, it should be 26 at the end. So for us, it was important to ensure that we give them a solution that lets them manage that mapping between the expense code and the type category and subcategory flexibly. So what we wanted is to say, if I were to change this and say, well, this is not actually a data collection expense, this is a flight expense, and update this, that I get a different expense code. And the one hopefully matching this category and subcategory. The way we managed
how Aptos and their Salesforce system are connected. Is there an integration, or is there an ETL that's doing this at some?
It's manual. We're exporting a report, and they're importing that into Aptos.
Okay.
So the code is generated in Salesforce and then brought to Aptos.
Exactly. And they need, well, this code and more specifically kind of a longer code in order to match to Aptos, otherwise it won't work.
Cool, thanks.
Oh, so let's have a look at the back end. So we said we wanted to, on one hand, ensure that this is working and updating, but then also ensure that the client remains as much ownership over the mapping of the codes as possible. Partially, this was quite frankly also as we were doing implementation, they kept delaying because they couldn't make up their minds about the coding and the mapping. So at some point we just said, what if we ensure that you have access to this and then you can decide whenever you're ready, and it doesn't have to be right now. So what do we use for these cases? Ideally, custom metadata types. And yes, I'm sneaking that into fun with flows because flows are more fun with custom metadata types. What we have here is we have a custom metadata type called Aptos expense code mapping. So for those of you who are not familiar with custom metadata types, they work quite similarly to a custom object in that you can set them up as you want, you can add fields to them, and you can even relate them to each other. One of the big differences, and Jesse can speak more about this and you'll find resources online as well, but one of the big differences between an object and the custom metadata type is that you can deploy these and they're also going to be mirrored back to your sandboxes. So once this is set up in production, anytime I create a sandbox, all of that information is available. Whether it's a partial copy or a developer sandbox, we have these mappings as well. There's a bit of limitation as well. I'll speak to one of them in a little bit. But currently, I think it's mostly about where you can access the custom metadata types, and it sounds like Salesforce is expanding their use rather than limiting it, so definitely something to look out for. In this case, we said we want an expense code mapping, and that should contain the Aptos expense code. We want a description for that so we can reference it, and then we want to know the category, subcategory, and type of the budget line that it applies to. If we go into managing the expense code records, so these are essentially records, right? Quite similar to what you'd have on a custom object, meaning that also the client can go in and create a new record here or change any of these existing ones. So if they wanted to say that expense of financial category project cost with subtype, subcategory flights should no longer be V3001, but something else, they could change this. On the flow side, this is the fun side. Let's have a look at what this looks like. So this is the project code calculation flow. I'm going to open this one. Again, this is launched through a process builder, right? So remember, for the auto launch flows, in this case, we didn't have any type of user interface. It's not the user going in and saying, you know, clicking next somewhere or having fields presented to them in a visual flow component, but it's really just them making updates, and the updates in turn leading to additional updates, similar to how a process builder workflow would work, but just a little bit more sophisticated. So again, we have a process builder that launches our flow and gives it the variable of the financial. Oh, this is not the right one. Sorry for that. It's a different one, also a fun one, but I don't think we'll have time for both of them. Back to flows. Expense code mapping, here we go. And this is also, I think, a good example of how flows don't need to be complicated, but you can leverage some of what they can do across data system, across your data model that you couldn't with a process builder. So you see here, there's no decisions, there's no branching. It's really very, very simple, but we can access something that in the flow that we can't in process builder, which is the expense code. So again, we start out by saying we want to look up our financial. We want to say what type of object we look up. So here we can have standard and custom objects. We want to know which field we want to look at. And then we want to store that in a variable, which we call financial, and which fields we want to store. So again, we don't need the full information of the financial. We just need to know the type, category, subcategory. And we need the expense code field because we want to populate that later on. The variable we're using here is an object variable. I don't think I've talked about this before. You can use, in terms of variables, you can have simple ones, which can be texts or numbers, currencies, dates, these types of like very simple data points. You can have object variables. I'll get to the collection as well, which is saying you want to actually store what is essentially a record. And you can have object collection variables, which is really cool because that allows you to store more than one record at the same time without saying how many records you wanted to store. So for example, if you wanted to later on go back to the scheduled payments you've created and find them all, you could find them all via lookup and store them in your object collection variable. So you could say, I want to look up not my financial, but my scheduled payments based on an ID I have, and then assign that to an object variable. So I actually find multiple records. I can also sort them, so that allows for some more cool functionality. Great. Once I have my financial, I want to find the expense code that's applicable. And here I can actually look at finding my custom metadata type record. So you will find in this list here, in the custom, where you have a lot of installed packages. But in addition to your custom objects, you also have the custom metadata type, denoted by MDT here. You also, in addition to the custom metadata type, you have custom settings. So this one, this project number index, is actually a custom setting, not a regular custom object. The difference in terms of flows, or one of the differences in terms of flows between custom metadata type and custom setting, is that you cannot update a custom metadata type through a flow. So the records are fixed. You can't create them, but you can find them. Whereas you can actually create and update custom settings through a flow. So we're finding the Aptos expense code mapping, and as mentioned previously, you can match based on multiple values. So rather than needing just one match, one ID, you can say, I actually just want to find the expense code mapping that matches the category, the subcategory, and the type. I'm going to store this again in a variable, as always. And I'm going to add the fields that I'm interested in. So in this case, I'm interested in the actual expense code. So if we look back at the custom metadata type, the expense code is just a field. And I've said, go look, find this, this, and this, find a match based on this. So imagine like a 3 VLOOKUPs in Excel or some kind of concatenation to find all of that. And then find the expense code that belongs to this combination of fields. Once I have that, I store it.
I have a quick question.
Yes, sure.
If you were to change the value on the custom metadata type for, say, the expense code, you would then need to run all of the flows again in order to update the values on the field, right?
Well, I would probably make a data update as a system admin, right?
Right.
Like an export, transform, upload. But yeah, definitely. Unless you want it to only be applicable going forward.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. Just checking.
Yeah, Jesse, I actually don't know whether you could run automation of a custom metadata type. Whether you could say if a custom metadata type record is updated, you want to also run something.
No, not right now. At least not declaratively. You could, I think you could do something with Apex, but I'm actually not sure. But again, just like from an efficiency, I would probably want to do it through data load rather than doing it through automation.
Yeah.
I'd have to have a good reason to go the other way around.
No, given that those are system admin updates, I think a data upload should do it. Great. Then you assign your expense code. So you pull on one side your variable which contains the expense code, and you map it to the object variable. So when you map anything here, where you look up any values, you always have a create new option, which is helpful because it's kind of a quicker way to access it than going through the resources on that side. You have your variables that you can select, and you have your object variables. So now I can look up my objects, and I can see the fields I have for them. One thing that I find personally a little bit confusing sometimes is that this actually gives you all the fields for financial. But if you recall, we didn't actually tell the flow to remember all of the fields on our financial, right? We don't have the amount, for example. It's not relevant in this use case. But if I were to now say equals the amount of the financial, I would probably get an error because it's not there. I haven't given it to the flow. So in this case, I want to have the expense code mapped here. So I can assign and say set this variable to this variable. Great, and then I end up with a fast update. So I just say, well, quickly go take the financial record. So I don't even have to tell it which fields to update. I just say take that same record again that corresponds to your object variable and update all of the fields that we had stored originally. And that's it. Any questions at this point? Or yeah.
Carol, I'll ask one while people think about questions. How do you approach, or can you explain the difference between, using fast versus using just a record? So like fast update versus record update, or fast create versus record create, fast lookup versus record lookup?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think I have the full answer to it. Some of this is related to what you can do. So in this fast update, I just tell it to use all of the fields again that it had before. If I were to look at in the palette, look at record update, I get different options, right? Oh, I have to drag it on, sorry. Different UI. So I have to actually go in and find, let's say, my financial. I need to match it. So I need to give the ID again, and then I need to say which fields I need to do. Whereas here in the fast update, I just say, take what you already have and run with that. Do you want to add to that, Jesse?
Sure. I think it relates back to what you were saying earlier about volume of records. Record, if you're using one of those record lookup, create, etc., those are targeted at cases when you have one specific record and you can very clearly identify it. But in the cases where you are picking up a collection, then you would be, and you should be, thinking more about using the fast lookups, creates, etc., just because they would be inserted into the database as one DML operation. So it's bulkified, basically.
Interesting. It's really cool.
Look at flows, they're bulkified.
Yeah, I thought they were also bulkified in other cases like that. Even if you have multiple records of the same time going through the same flow, that it actually bulkifies to a certain extent.
Yeah, there's another bulkification process that's happening with flows in terms of like when they stop at they basically stop at every stage as they go along. But that's a longer article, and they're actually changing that as well.
Great. Cool. Questions from the teams? Okay, sounds like you're now all well positioned to configure your own flows. Okay, that might be a little overly optimistic. Mel, anything from you specifically thinking about the EJAF use case?
Sorry, I just had to play with the microphone there. No, I don't think I do. The first example was really, really helpful for that, and I can definitely map the EJAC use case onto what you created in the flow. But no, I think I'm clear on that. Thank you so much.
I have a question.
Oh, Gina has a question.
I've sometimes struggled with the unique name situation because I guess it's because I often don't know what to name them yet, and then if I name one thing something, and then it won't let me, even if sometimes I just run into problems with the second element having the same unique name or something like that. I'm not really sure what this question is about, but basically, can you talk a little bit about the unique naming?
Yeah, I can try. I think the area where I most often see that is with decisions, right? Because anything that I add in here, an outcome in itself, also ends up being a resource. So all of these that are listed here need to be unique. And if you need to look up your financial twice and you, for some reason, need to have that be different elements, then you need to have them named differently. If that makes sense. You can actually, if you've ever received a process builder error, those are those are in the backend, like the real backend, those are flows as well. And you'll always see these like my variable 1, my variable 2, my outcome 1, my decision 3, and so on. Those are really just the names of all of these resources that we name a little bit more properly.
Okay. So I can just in theory name it like a lookup financial 2 or something, and that's okay.
Yeah, for example, I think I would look at the specific use case and try and find something that makes it easy to understand, right? Why is it 1 versus 2? What's the difference?
Okay.
Yeah, I'd
But
agree
sorry,
with Carol. Just to add to Carol's point, I think doing what you want to do is you want to be as specific as possible with the idea that somebody else who has no idea should be able to come in, look at it, and understand what it's meant to be doing and what each kind of decision node, what direction it goes in. So that should kind of drive any naming beyond any suggested conventions.
Okay. Thank you.
I did have a question generally rather than about the 2 specific flows. This is Mel, by the way. How flows, I guess, are maybe on the more technical side of things if we're thinking about the system admin and handing over the system to the client. How does their capacity feed into, if at all, into our thinking about like how to design a flow or if we need to use a flow? I was just wondering if you had any kind of thoughts about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the general thought is always go with the simplest tool that will do the job. So if you could do it with a process builder, don't just use a flow because they're fun. Go with the simpler version, right? Because as you say, I think it's a very valid concern that system admins will learn process builder more easily than they will learn flow. Very often the way we use flow these days is when we're doing things that previously you had to code. So now we're essentially trying to use flow rather than Apex, and in that way also bringing it closer to the user, closer to the system admin, and making it more manageable on their side. And then yeah, it depends on the kind of system admin that you have, whether they have the capacity to learn flows or not. But I would still always go with the simplest tool that will do the job. Jesse, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything you said. You don't want to smash something with when you can do it a lot simpler. So keep it stupid simple is what I've said frequently. But the idea behind the flows, again, as Carol you suggested, is that it lowers the barrier of what somebody can do. So it really brings something that previously would have been technical and required a dev into the hands of a competent admin. Either way, if you can achieve it with a flow, I'm kind of inclined to go that way as opposed to Apex, assuming that it meets any kind of general platform standards. And then it's an easier process, I think, to teach an admin that than to teach them code, because they should not be, and they probably shouldn't be maintaining the code themselves.
Cool, thank
Yeah.
you.
The other thing to think of when you're, kind of very often now we see things that are maybe even scoped as being a trigger, where we go in and say, well, this could actually potentially be a flow. Even if you have something where you're 100% sure that you will need some custom development, think through whether everything needs to be in the trigger or whether you might just have a specific piece of the logic that needs to sit in Apex and that you could use a flow to steer. So we've had 2 examples in the past that come to mind. One was a complex algorithm to calculate a checksum digit for MEDER, where they needed that algorithm, but we wanted to be in control over when and how that would get calculated. And so we used the flow, and the flow made use of an invocable method, invocable method. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's right.
So kind of referencing a piece of Apex. And the other example where we've had it, where we haven't actually implemented it yet, is for IGC. They wanted an email trigger to send emails to contacts that aren't directly related to the record that's kind of kicking off the entire logic. And what we talked about there was similar, a piece of Apex that would just get as an input parameter from the flow would just receive the email addresses of the people, or I think it might have been the contact IDs from the people, and the template that should be used, which means that we minimize the use of Apex and keep as much logic as possible, as, for example, which template should be used, which people should be written to, and so on. Keep that on the configuration side so that we can adjust it if the client has, a change in requirement, or, wants to update the template at some point in some form that, wasn't initially thought about.
I think one last word I'll say is, as much as flows can and do a lot of things, you want to make sure that you're following general automation best practices. So you really don't want to be mixing things across on a particular object, having Apex and declarative automation and triggers and a whole bunch of things mixed up, especially as it impacts order of operations. So you really want to have somebody cross-check that and ultimately have Owen cross-check it to see that he's happy with the approach that you're taking in terms of involving flows or anything else with the rest of your automation.
Thanks to both of you. That was very helpful.
Great.
Carol?
Thank you. Yeah?
Sorry, I know we're out of time, Carol, but can I just ask you a question as well?
Sure.
Sure. I've noticed that flows let you do translations using Translation Workbench and exporting those as templates. And flows also have the capacity to send emails without creating email alerts. So you have this ability to just send an email out of a flow without having to pre-create an email template and an email alert. Wondering if you would say that it would be a good use case to use flows for when we want to send out email templates in different languages, because currently you can't translate those without Visualforce code.
Interesting. I think there's a big limitation in terms of sending emails from flows in terms of merge fields. That's also why we had ended up, thinking about that Apex component for IGC. I haven't played with translations and flows either yet, but one of the thoughts might be whether, rather than sending the email, or rather, thinking about what part of this needs to be handled through flow rather than through something else. Is it really everything? Is it the translation and the sending of the email? Or do you really just want to take care of one piece of it, maybe the translation, store that translation somewhere else, and then access it again? But those are just kind of off the top of my head thought. I haven't had examples before, but it sounds really interesting.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. I think this is only something I recently came across, so it's just something I'll also chat to Jesse about. Could be useful, might not be, we'll see.
Yeah. Would be an interesting use case if you do end up, or when you do solve it, post it on Chatter.
Always.
Great.
Thanks, Carol.
Cool. Yeah, great. Then I think that concludes Fun with Flows for today. Reach out to the group on Chatter if you have any kind of other questions or want to see other examples. I think there's a list of them in there as well, and plenty of other people who can give you walkthroughs and talk about why flows are so much fun.
Carol, thanks so much for doing this. This is really awesome.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.